So
Yeah,
it's the view of the Taxpayers Union then that Kiwibank shouldn't be beefed up by the New Zealand taxpayer, it should instead be sold, is that correct?
Yes, 100%. So the government has no business owning a bank. The role of the government is to set the rules of the game and create an environment where that's conducive to competition and allow the private sector to get on and do it better. What we've seen from across most of history around the world, but also in New Zealand, is that government-owned businesses and state-owned enterprises consistently underperform the private sector in terms of both the quality of the service, the price to consumers, and also in terms of productivity and revenue generated. So we think that actually the government should focus on reducing some of the more burdensome regulation that's stifling competition, that the Commerce Commission also briefly touched on. And the best way to do that is actually get Kiwibank listed on the New Zealand market, allow private investors to come in that have the hustle and the innovation to want to grow Kiwibank rather than competing against an ever-growing list of government priorities for capital.
Yes, the Commerce Commission, in actual fact, found that New Zealand's four largest banks, that's the ANZ, the ASB, BNZ and Westpac, do not face strong competition in this country.
Yeah, and so I think that's, what you hear a lot is, how greedy the New Zealand banks are, and they're making much larger profits than the banks in Australia and in different parts around the world. But I put the question to your listeners, are all banks in the world greedy? I would argue yes. And if New Zealand banks are making substantially higher profits or returns than banks all around the world, surely they would be flocking to come here. The reason that they're not is because we have such high levels of regulation and capital requirement rules and high barriers to entry that actually stop more competitors coming into the New Zealand market and make it more difficult for people to become banks and to lend out to different kinds of businesses and things. And so what we see is, banks focusing a lot of the energy on safer investments, mainly mortgages and things, to the detriment of, for example, a lot of farmers and other businesses that they may be seeking capital that way. But we think that, Kiwibank, is underperforming. The government has no business owning it, and if we took that money and instead either used it to pay down debt or returned it back to taxpayers themselves could choose to invest in Kiwibank if they want, or could invest it elsewhere.
So your argument essentially is the stable oligopoly that the Commerce Commission describe of the four Australian banks. I think they've got 85 or 90% of all of the banking in New Zealand at the moment, which is an awful lot. You're suggesting that rather than get Kiwibank to be a disruptor, and by a disruptor you mean sort of challenge them on price, the price of money essentially, for New Zealand consumers and businesses, that the best way to do it would be to ensure there was more competition into the New Zealand market by reducing the regulatory barriers to entry and expansion, I guess.
Yes, that's part of it. But equally, if you want Kiwibank to be a disruptor, what you need that the shareholders of any company, if they've got a vested interest and it's their own money on the line, they are the ones that are going to be, hustling the board and the management to be making a greater return. And the way you make a greater return is to grow your market share by either, lowering your prices or increasing the amount that you pay to your account holders. Or running things more efficiently, or delivering better services. And so, governments are, infamously bad at running companies. A private market would do that better, which would actually end up growing Kiwibank's market share if it was performing well, and that would increase some competition. But equally, some of the other regulatory barriers as well are certainly worth addressing.
Yes, there's no proof, is there, that Kiwibank has been what it was meant to be. It was set up originally it was an ideological, it wasn't a commercial decision a government of the day made. Jim Anderton did it as part of the deal for joining, I think, the Helen Clark government way back in, 1999. So when it was set up at the start of this century. It really hasn't performed, has it, over 2 decades? It hasn't done the job that it was meant to do, which is to give ordinary New Zealanders access to services that are cheaper and better than the international competitors.
Yeah, and I think the proof in the pudding is that New Zealanders are voting with their feet. we've got this New Zealand-owned bank, but when people choose who to get their mortgage with or where to deposit their money, overwhelmingly they're putting it with the other banks because they're getting better services from them. And I was actually looking at one of Kiwibank's recent reports recently, and they announced in 2023 one of their major achievements was the introduction of Apple Pay. Well, the other banks got that back in 2016. I think that's kind of symptomatic of what happens when you have a government-run company. There's not that incentive or entrepreneurial spirit to innovate and adapt and become cutting edge and a market leader that you get with those private companies. And so I think that's that's the kind of thing that you're missing out on. And equally, having a government-owned bank, you lose a lot of that autonomy and flexibility that you get in the private sector because there always are political constraints. And so the government might argue, they operate at arm's length and they operate as a commercial entity. But the fact of the matter is that if they're operating in the exact way that if it would operate as if it's privately owned, then there's no difference in whether it's owned by the government or privately, except the government wouldn't have all this money tied up in a bank where it's putting taxpayers' money potentially at risk or trading that money off against other better uses. But then on the flip side, if there is government influence or control or political constraints, that is also another issue because it lowers the return that taxpayers are getting than if they invested that money themselves in another bank elsewhere.
I thought somebody Hughes just pointed out to me, and I think he's right in that. In fact, he says, well, the government wanted to support Kiwibank, you'd think they'd bank with them, but they don't. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, I believe they bank with Westpac. I'm not sure if that's across all of government. I know in the past, slightly tongue-in-cheek, when different rich listers and the likes have said, I want to pay more tax and that I don't think I pay enough tax. And so we've sent them the government's bank account details, which is a Westpac account, and said, well, you're more than welcome to voluntarily chip in, and surprise, none of them have. But I guess that's just a side note. But yeah, the government doesn't bank with Kiwibank. They probably get a better service from the other banks, and so yeah, I guess if even the government doesn't back that service, why should the rest of New Zealand?
No, it's just. Listen, I don't disagree with you. Holding on to Kiwibank's crazy. The recommendation from the Commerce Commission, though, is that the government, as Kiwibank's owner, should consider what is necessary to make Kiwibank a disruptive competitor, including how to provide it with access to more capital. And it's saying, in the shorter term, capitalising Kiwibank appears to have the greatest potential to constrain the major banks and disrupt the market. It's the Commerce Commission's report of this week. I guess you'd be saying, well, don't think about the short term, think about the medium and long term.
Well, I think that capital can come from the private market. I think if you think about, you're a government, you're a politician, you've got all these different trading off incentives, or different issues you have to trade off. If Kiwibank comes to you and says, look, we want so many $1 billion or hundreds of millions to invest in this new innovation or development in order to grow the bank, or we want to cut off dividends temporarily in order to generate a higher return in the future, a politician's going to think, well, I want this money to invest in health or education or tax cuts or any number of things. So it's a lot harder to make that value proposition to a politician who has to deal with everything else that's got going on. Whereas if you're a private shareholder and Kiwibank comes to you with a solid value proposition, you're more likely to accept that because you know that you're going to be the one that's profiting from that decision. Whereas as a politician, those returns might not come for another 10, 20 years, at which point you're not going to be in government anymore. Why would you waste your political capital on that?